Then he became aware of the audience. The men by the tractor, 2 workers at the gas plant, one clasping his hands to his head after the near escape, and a shirt-sleeved man from the administrative building gaping in the open doorway. Lee gave them a cheerful wave and turned back to make the balloon safe. He was proud of this balloon. He'd won it in a poker game 6 months before in Texas. He was 24, ready for adventure, and happy to go wherever the winds took him. He'd better be, as Hester reminded him. He wasn't going to go anywhere else. Blown by the winds of chance then, and very slightly aided by the first half of a tattered book called The Elements of Aerial Navigation, which his opponent in the poker game had thrown in free, the second half was missing, he had drifted into the Arctic, stopping wherever he could find work, and eventually landed on this island. Novi Odense looked like a place where there was work to be done, and Lee's pockets were well nigh empty. He worked for an hour or 2 to make everything secure, and then, assuming the nonchalance proper to a prince of the air, he sauntered over to the administrative building to pay for the storage of the balloon. Now, just a quick word about this book, The Elements of Aerial Navigation, which, as you can see, is torn at the bottom of the page. One of the things that was great fun with putting this book together, as with Lyra's Oxford, was inventing these fake bits of printed ephemera, stuff like this. There is no such thing as a book called The Elements of Aerial Navigation, or if there is, this ain't it. But anyway, the bit that's missing is the chapter is the chapter headed "How to Land a Balloon." So that's why he didn't know how to land the balloon. But what he can do is assume the nonchalance. So he, assuming the nonchalance, he walks away to the administrative building. "You come here for the oil?" said the clerk behind the counter. "He came for flying lessons," said a man sitting by the stove drinking coffee. "Oh, yeah," said the clerk. "We saw you land. Impressive." "What kind of oil would that be?" said Lee. "Ha," said the clerk, winking. "All right, you're kidding. I got it. You heard nothing from me about any oil rush. I could tell you are a roughneck, but I won't say a word. You working for Larsen Manganese?" "I'm an aeronaut," said Lee. "That's why I have a balloon. You going to give me a receipt for that?" "Here," said the clerk, stamping it and handing it over. Lee tucked it into his pocket and said, "What's Larsen Manganese?" "Big rich mining company. You rich?" "Does it look like it?" "No." "Well, you got that right," said Lee. "Anything else I got to do before I go and spend all my money?" "Customs," said the clerk. "Over by the main gate." Lee found the Customs and Revenue Office easily enough and filled in a form under the instructions of a stern young officer. "I see you have a gun," the officer said. "Is that against the law?" "No." "Are you working for Larsen Manganese?" "I only been here 5 minutes," said Lee, "and already 2 people asked me that. I never heard of Larsen Manganese before I landed here." "Lucky," said the customs officer. "Open your kit bag, please." Lee offered it and its meager contents for inspection. It took about 5 seconds. "Thank you, Mr. Scoresby," said the officer. "It will be a good idea to remember that the only legitimate agency of the law here on Novi Odense is the Office of Customs and Revenue. There is no police force. That means that if anyone transgresses the law, we deal with it, and let me assure you that we do so without hesitation." "Glad to hear it," said Lee. "Give me a law-abiding place any day." He swung his kit bag over his shoulder and set out for the town. It was late spring, and the snow was dirty and the road pitted with potholes. Despite the blustery wind, the town smelt richly of its industrial products. There were refineries for fish oil, seal oil, and rock oil. There was a tannery and a fish pickling factory, and various effluvia from all of them assailed Lee's nose or stung his eyes as the wind brought their fragrance down the narrow streets. The most interesting thing was the bears. The first time Lee saw one slouching casually out of an alley, he could scarcely believe his eyes. Gigantic, ivory-furred, silent, the creature's expression was impossible to read, but there was no mistaking the immense power in those limbs, those claws, that air of inhuman self-possession. There were more of them further into town. Gathered in small groups at street corners, sleeping in alleyways, and occasionally working, pulling a cart or lifting blocks of stone on a building site. The townspeople took no notice of them except to avoid them on the pavement. They didn't look at them either, Lee noticed. They want to pretend they're not there, said Hester. For the most part, the bears ignored the people, but once or twice Lee saw a glance of sullen anger in a pair of small, intense black eyes, or heard a low and quickly suppressed growl as a well-dressed woman stood expectantly waiting to be made way for. But both bears and people stepped aside when a couple of men in a uniform of maroon came strolling down the center of the pavement. They wore pistols and carried batons, and Lee supposed them to be customs men. All in all, the place was suffused with an air of tension and anxiety. I'll stop reading there because I want you to read it.